Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is James Mallinson. James is Senior Lecturer in Sanskrit and Classical and Indian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He took his BA in Sanskrit and Old Iranian at the University of Oxford, followed by an MA in Area Studies, South Asia, with ethnography as his main subject at SOAS. His doctoral thesis, submitted to the University of Oxford, was a critical edition and annotated translation of the Khecarīvidyā, an early text of Hatha Yoga. Dr. Mallinson has published 8 books, all of which are editions and translations of Sanskrit yoga texts, epic tales, and poetry. His recent work has used philological study of Sanskrit texts, ethnography, and art history to explore the history of yoga and yogis. His most recent book, written in collaboration with Dr. Mark Singleton, is Roots of Yoga, which was published by Penguin Classics in 2017. From 2015 to 2020, Dr. Mallinson will be leading a European Research Council-funded research project on the history of Hatha Yoga, which will result in 10 critical editions and translations of key yoga texts, 4 monographs, and 2 large conferences to be held at SOAS in 2017 and 2019. So with that, hello, James. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Jacob.
So it's a real pleasure to talk to you today, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion about your really groundbreaking research on the translation and of key Hatha Yoga texts, some of which have never been translated into English. But before we get into that conversation, I'd love to hear just a little bit about your own kind of personal story and what led you to the research work that you do.
Okay. Yeah, that's reasonably easy. I think that was all triggered by going to India at the age of 17, in between. So we have in the UK, students quite often take what's called a gap year between, I think you would say high school and college. So we would say between school and university. And I'd already, for various strange reasons, probably the most important of which was meeting my prospective tutors, I'd already decided to read Sanskrit as an undergraduate. And friends of mine had been in India on gap years and come back and regaled me with tales about what a wonderful time they'd had. And so I then, after earning a bit of money in London, I then went off to India at the beginning of 1988, and I had 7 months ahead of me and a pocket full of traveller's checks and not much plan. And off I went and had such a great time that, that changed my life. In fact, the friend that I went with, Alex Watson, who was a friend from school, it also changed his life. He's now a professor of Indian philosophy at Ashoka University in Delhi.
Oh, wow.
And so I then came back to England at the end. Well, at the end of that trip, I spent a few weeks in Kashmir with a bunch of sadhus and yogis who were about to do the Amarnath Yatra. And so that was the first time I properly got to hang out with sadhus. And that became a kind of bigger and bigger part of every trip I made to India after that, and I've been to India every year since. Probably spent a total of, I don't know, around 10 or 11 or 12 years in India. Most of it, or a lot of it, living and traveling with yogis and sadhus. And so after my undergraduate degree in Sanskrit, I wanted to, somehow keep being able to justify going off to India and spending long periods living with these yogis. And the obvious way to do that was to sort of continue my academic career. I decided to, as you said in the introduction, my MA, I went and did an MA at SOAS, which the major subject was ethnography or anthropology. And that was great. I did enjoy that, but particularly at that time, I think there was a lot of theory and method and kind of theoretical analysis going on in anthropology. And I got slightly fed up with that. And so when it came to returning to continue my academic career, I knew I wanted to focus on, somehow learn more about these yogi and sadhu traditions I was living with, I decided I would use my Sanskrit skills to do that. So for my PhD, I was very lucky to get accepted to study under Professor Alexis Sanderson back in Oxford, who was one of the tutors that I met, that fateful time when I was 16 or 17. I went to Oxford for an open day. And I wanted to find a Sanskrit text that had some relevance to this sort of world of rather kind of wild, wandering bubbas that I was part of. And in fact, there are very few that have any direct relevance to that world. And just about the only ones that are the ones on Hatha Yoga. I mean, I was already interested in yoga, but because of that, my choices were limited to texts on Hatha Yoga. So I searched out, I tried to find a text that hadn't been edited or published before, i.e. a text that was only available in manuscripts. And I was very much helped in that by a book by a Frenchman called Christian Bouy, who was probably the first, in fact, almost certainly the first sort of serious scholar to really look at the texts of the physical Hatha Yoga tradition. And he'd identified this text called the Khecarīvidyā as being important, and it was, of course, unpublished, so I settled on that. And from reading his book and from digging around a bit more, I discovered there were about, I knew of 7 manuscripts of the text, but I ended up finding 30. Okay, as I realized, it was catalogued under more names and so forth. So that's my excuse for why it took me 6 years to finish my PhD. And then after that, so I finished my PhD, but what I realized then, okay, so I focused on this one particular fairly esoteric, focused text on Hatha Yoga. So it's about Khecarīvidyā, about the practice in which you turn your tongue back above your palate in order to drink the amrita, the nectar of immortality that's dripping from the top of your head. But what I realized was that the bigger picture of Hatha Yoga that I'd read about in secondary literature, so books by scholars trying to analyze the history of physical yoga practice, was that none of it made sense anymore. There were so many things that I would read about that didn't fit with either my textual studies or what I was seeing in the field with yogis. So I spent the next 7 or 8 years kind of informally researching that. So I kept going to India and I kept gathering more and more manuscripts, and I was reading the manuscripts. But at the same time, I had a job as a translator for the Clay Sanskrit Library. So there's this big project producing translations of Sanskrit poetry. But this was a fantastic job because it gave me the freedom to be where I wanted to be, to do what I wanted to do. I had one meeting and one deadline a year, and I'm very much kind of last-minute person with my deadlines, but in that context, last few months, and the last 2 or 3 months of each year were generally a mad scrabble to I would just sit down and lock myself away for a couple of months and translate non-stop to get that work done. But the rest of the time I was kind of, it gave me the freedom to carry on with research on yoga without even really publishing. I had no, my academic career has been somewhat unorthodox in that I never really intended to pursue it as such. So I felt no necessity to publish, and I just amassed huge amounts of notes and transcriptions of manuscripts and so forth, which most of it is still sitting unpublished on my laptop. But at the end, suddenly the translation project came to a sort of crashing halt with no warning, and then I found myself out in the wilderness somewhat, wondering, with a young family starting and all of that, wondering how the hell I was going to support myself. So one of the things I did was start churning out academic articles using the research I've been doing, and so I was able to present a kind of new understanding of the history of Hatha Yoga, which I think really, I mean, it wasn't that people had studied the same stuff before and got it wrong. It's basically people had not really studied it closely at all. No one had done any serious text critical study of the texts of Hatha Yoga, and at the same time, no one had really spent time living with yogis in India, no academics anyway, and exploring their yoga practice. And then through combining the two, I was able to kind of reassess which traditions were responsible for what, and when these practices came about and where they came from and so forth. So I started producing articles then. They seemed to go down well. And then I was very lucky in 2013, I think it was, a position came up at SOAS, the Sanskrit position there, and I applied for that. Got lucky. I think probably they recognized that, another way I've been very lucky is that this I call it a career. It never felt like it only feels like a career now, but it didn't for the first 20 years. But this career of mine has coincided with the huge boom in physical yoga practice around the world. So suddenly when I started working on it, it seemed very esoteric. And
suddenly your work has currency. Yeah,
exactly. So that was another lucky break, I guess.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, it's very refreshing to hear that, a scholar, you spent much of your scholarly life really just pursuing it for the passion of it. I feel like that's not a common refrain so much anymore. It's, publish or perish, and that's sort of the primary incentive. So it's wonderful that you've been able to really pursue this from the passion of it, and it just sort of things aligned in a way that was, again, gave your work currency. So I want to ask you about this word philologist. That I was watching one of the videos of you giving a talk, and the woman who introduces you says you self-identify as a philologist. And I hear this word here and there. Most famously, I think, was Nietzsche considered himself a philologist, but besides that, you don't really see it much anymore. So what is philology, and how does the method of philology differ from how other scholars of ancient texts might approach translation and whatnot?
Well, yeah, it's a very good, difficult question, and quite a lot of ink has been spilt, or whatever the digital equivalent is. Bytes have been flicked or flipped, but trying to explain what it is. And I guess the sort of most prominent in my world, the most prominent theorist these days is Sheldon Pollock, and I think his kind of basic working definition is that philology is trying to make sense of texts.
I see.
I use it in a more specific way, kind of as it was done perhaps in the 19th, maybe possibly the 18th century, definitely the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, meaning kind of text critical studies. So looking at the original sources, original witnesses, manuscripts, and in the context of Sanskrit text, that involves, normally with a text, some texts, you only find one manuscript, but almost that's unusual. Normally you have a bunch of manuscripts and you get them all together and then you collate them. You look at the different readings. So it's a bit like Chinese whispers, particularly if the texts are generally, so the texts I work with are generally sort of 800 to 500 years old, from about maybe the 11th, 12th century up to the 15th, 16th century. That's the area I focus on. And just about none of the manuscripts, there may be one manuscript, and even that one I'm not sure about, that I've ever worked with. None of them are from the time when the text was written, because paper doesn't last, more than 200 or 300 years in India. So these texts have had to be copied and copied and copied. So a Maharaja or a big temple would have a library, and they would have scribes who would keep copying the manuscripts in their possession. Because of the heat and the humidity and the insects and so forth, the manuscripts don't last. So what you do is you end up, like I said, with my Khecarīvidyā, my PhD thesis, I ended up with about 30 manuscripts of this text. And they all have different readings in some places more than others. And so my job is to look at the differences on a tiny scale, and also on a bigger sort of structural scale. Sometimes whole chunks will be moved around, or a chapter will be left out. And then on one level, you can then group together the manuscripts or witnesses, because obviously if a group of manuscripts share particularly a mistake, mistakes are more significant than things that are correct. But if they share a big mistake, then you can kind of group them together and think that they've descended from one original manuscript, which was the first to have that mistake. But then by looking at all of that, you then try and work out a sort of family tree. Philology sometimes gets criticized as being almost like sort of eugenics, that you're trying to create the original text and go back to the true, pure lineage. Sometimes it gets sort of talked about in the same breath as Nazism, for example. And, because the Nazis were associated with Indian philology to some extent. And, some people have tried to tar us all with the same brush. But that actually, that's not how it's done. So, for example, with the Khecarīvidyā, it can be in some cases. In some texts, you can, with some texts, you can try to recreate the original, but with most texts, that's actually always going to be impossible. Because, say, texts are often written. Some texts are quite obscure for the first few centuries of their existence, and then suddenly get popular, and then they get changed and so forth as a result because of the new historical context. So with the Khecarīvidyā, what I was trying to do, I could see by looking at the different manuscripts. So the earliest layer of the text, it clearly was produced by the kind of a Kaula left-hand tantric tradition in which antinomian sort of unorthodox rites were current, in particular drinking alcohol. So in the oldest recension of the text, there are lots of verses in praise of Madira, which means alcohol. And that was then changed in subsequent manuscripts to Khecarī, which nicely fits the meter as well, generally. And so that in itself, so this is, it sounds like tedious work, and it is often very tedious work, because you have to sit there and, particularly when there aren't any significant variants, and you've got to read through a manuscript and add and check it against all the other ones. It can be very slow and boring work. But it's by building up from the significant variations that you do find, you can then draw these bigger, then you can kind of step back and draw big conclusions about the big picture of the topic that you're studying. So, it became clear with the Khecarīvidyā that a more orthodox, a more kind of ascetic, perhaps, a more straight-laced yogic tradition took over the text, wanted to get rid of these kind of more unorthodox, extreme tantric practices and bring it more in line with what was going on. And again, the only way you can make sense of this is by looking at how the text has changed over the years. So yeah, that's philology. It had a rather bad press, particularly in sort of 20, 30 years ago. Post-modernism came along, and people thought it was. I've never. Put it this way: no one who's ever done this kind of work has ever decided it was pointless. There's been a lot of sniping from the sidelines by people who can't do it and bothered to do it, and who think it's try and say it's some kind of elitist, essentialist project. But no, and it's the only way to do good history, especially when the only sources you've got are text.
So are there actually any philology departments? I feel like I've never seen a philology department before.
There aren't. There used to be. There may be in Germany, actually.
Oh, okay.
There used to be big departments of philology, and you used to have professors of philology or professors of Indian philology. Now, generally there are professors of Indology, and you ask them, they might say that Indology is Indian philology. In fact, Sheldon Pollock, a recent article by him, argues that in order to sort out the humanities, because obviously humanities are going through a bit of a crisis in university at the moment, he thinks that they should reintroduce departments of philology. It makes sense from the inside, but I'm not sure it would make sense.
And he thinks that would save humanities?
Yeah, because he thinks, I think he's quite right. A hell of a lot of what humanities scholars are doing is trying to make sense of text in that base. And so that's a way of kind of bridging the walls that have been, or if that's not quite the right metaphor, breaking down the walls that have been created within the academy between different disciplines.
I see. Because you could have a philology of a variety of texts from a variety of different disciplines. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. So then scholars in different regions and different areas of the humanities could talk to each other.
Interesting. Okay, so let's move on to Hatha Yoga. So just to get real, introductory here, I would love for you to just kind of explain what Hatha Yoga is, and then maybe we can just move into kind of the history of where it all comes from.
Okay. Well, I laugh because I'm writing a very overdue paper on the subject right now, and of course,
perfect.
My understanding of what Hatha Yoga is changes from month to month almost. Well,
interesting.
It gets added to or altered, and in the introduction of this paper, I go into this to some extent because I'm now running this big research project. There's 5, 6 of us on the team now, and it's mainly philological, but there's also anthropology. So I get out to do a bit of field work every now and then, but we've got one member of the team is sort of on almost permanent field work at the moment. She'll be writing up over the coming years. But one of the things that she's been doing, and I've been with her occasionally, is asking these yogis and asking people in India what is Hatha Yoga, to try and get to the bottom of it. And almost without exception, maybe 1 or 2% will answer in the way you might expect, i.e. the way that Hatha Yoga is defined and used in Sanskrit texts. But the rest of them have a quite different answer. And so the word Hatha in Sanskrit, or Hat in Hindi, can mean force, but it also means kind of stubbornness, persistence, doing something bloody-mindedly. You have that, is that an American phrase? We talk about being bloody-minded in England, which means
it's not an American phrase, but I think we get it.
So you kind of so it's basically aiming, having a goal in mind and doing whatever it takes to get there. So one yogi kind of said, it's like a traveler following a path on a long journey. In the path, the road will wind around hazardous obstacles like a forest or a lake or a mountain or whatever, whereas the Hatha yogi would just walk straight, and whenever the path takes a bend, he'll ignore it and go straight through the dangerous forest or whatever. And more than several times, actually, both of us have been told by yogis, they'll say to us, okay, so you guys are academics. If you decided you were going to do whatever it takes to become a professor, it doesn't matter who you piss off on the way, what unethical behavior you do, that would be Hatha Yoga.
Wow.
And so when that's applied in the context of religious practice, it's generally used to refer to, the sort of extreme, really difficult, dangerous practices undertaken by certain ascetics. Most obviously these kind of physical austerities, such as standing up for years on end and so forth, because those methods are seen as dangerous, but also, if you survive them, the most efficacious at reaching the goal.
Okay.
And then Hatha Yoga in text, and this is that I haven't actually written yet in this paper, so this is good for me to work it out and say it. But Hatha Yoga in the text is used very specifically, and it's really a scholarly construct to describe physical methods that help the process of yoga. Now, it seems that these physical methods were developed among these celibate, ascetic traditions, some of whom engaged in these extreme austerities. But in particular, in the earliest formulations, in the first text to teach Hatha Yoga and describe its practices, teach a systematic form of it, its practices, the distinctive practices of Hatha Yoga, because they're used in addition to, in this text, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, they are used in addition to the 8 angas of Patanjala Yoga. And the practices are these 9 mudras, 9 physical techniques for controlling the vital energies, basically the breath and bindu, or semen in men. So it's the way the physiology is understood in these early Hatha Yoga texts is that this bindu is being produced in the head, in the skull of men, and is constantly dripping down and being expended through being ejaculated or being burnt up in the fire in the stomach, and that process is responsible for old age and dying. But there are techniques you can use to reverse this. So, and these techniques include, for example, the Khecarīvidyā mudra, the tongue practice. By doing that seals the amrita in the head, or by doing a headstand that uses gravity to reverse the flow, and so forth. So these methods, the way I understand it, they were developed by these celibate yogis as being their kind of complementary or even essential physical techniques to preserve and enhance the benefits of celibacy, which are crucial to the yoga practice of these ascetics.
So you've said a couple of interesting things I want to go back to. So one is that, one of the kind of common ways that people define hatha, you define it as force or stubbornness, bloody-mindedness, and it's people often translate it as sun and moon. It's this way of like capturing the kind of unified nature of yoga. So where does that definition come from?
Okay. Yeah, well, then that's a good question. And that first appears in a text called the Yoga Bija, which is probably 14th century, and then crops up in a few subsequent texts. But to me, I think the reason, because an interesting thing, again, that I've been writing about in this paper is that the name Hatha Yoga Even when it gets introduced in the 15th century in this text, the Hatha Pradipika, the light on Hatha, which becomes the go-to text for anyone after that who's writing about Hatha yoga. But quite a lot of texts don't actually use the word Hatha after that. Almost the majority of texts, because I think it does have this connotation of extreme sort of bloody-minded behavior that would be associated with slightly crazy ascetics and so forth. And so the texts either ignore it, just don't use the word. They teach the practices, but they don't use the phrase Hatha yoga or the word Hatha. Or, like the Khecarīvidyā, they offer this new kind of what's been called the sort of esoteric definition. And you get this, get these kind of definitions quite a lot in saying, so it's not Hatha yoga. It's not yoga by means of Hatha, i.e. by means of force or stubbornness or whatever. It's Hatha yoga, in which yoga means union and Ha and Ta are the sun and the moon. I always get it. I'm never quite sure. I've got this wrong so many times that I think I'll never get it right again. Anyway, Ha is the sun and Ta is the moon, or versa. But one of the reasons why I get it wrong is because this is an artificial construct. You don't find it anywhere else. I've looked into, and others, my colleagues, have looked into these big kind of mantra dictionaries, and it's not like Ha means the sun and Ta means the moon. It's a way of kind of overriding the obvious connotation of the phrase of extreme or practice by saying, no, that's not what it means. It means uniting the sun and the moon, which corresponds to the left and right breath, or the sun in the stomach and the moon in the head, and so forth.
All right, so it's not without textual precedent, because you said it's in the Khecarīvidyā, because I asked that because I sort of thought maybe it was just a modern invention that fluffy modern day yogis made up.
Mm-hmm. No. Certainly, it's got textual precedent, and it does. It is. You do see it. It's not only in that text as well. It does crop up in subsequent texts to some extent. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then the other one that I thought was, the other thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting, the idea of Hatha being related to force, and and really force being like if the straight path leads through some unethical, unethical from a certain perspective decisions, you're gonna get there. That's Hatha, but that's very interesting because Hatha yoga is often associated with kind of ethical principles, whether they are from the Yoga Sutras or from somewhere else. But here's what I hear you saying is that the practice or the discipline of Hatha doesn't really have an alignment with any particular ethical framework. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think to some extent. Well, again, we've got to draw the distinction between the use of Hatha as it's understood in sort of vernacular discourse, when it's being used in Hindi and so forth, or from when it appears in the text, where it might then be reinterpreted as Ha plus Ta, sun and moon, because we do find in some texts, the Hatha Pradipika, even though it doesn't list the yamas and niyamas, which would be the sort of the ethics of yoga. It does mention them once in passing, I think, and it says that ahimsa is the best of them. So yes, I think as I say, you've got to draw a distinction between this scholarly construct that is Hatha yoga, in which I think we would find ethical practice, and then the vernacular living understanding of the concept of Hatha yoga, in which perhaps not. Maybe I shouldn't overplay the ethical side of it. Although, even in its earliest mentions, so this is again a part of my paper I need to work through a bit more. And here I'm building to some extent on the work of my colleague Jason Birch, who published a paper in 2011 called The Meaning of Hatha. And the earliest references to it come actually in Tantric Buddhist works from the late first millennium. And there it seems to be used in the context. It is seen almost as unethical or going against the usual methods of practice. Unethical, again, perhaps a bit strong, but it corresponds to, because these Tantric Buddhist cults and traditions from the late first millennium, sexual rituals were central to their practices, but not as we might understand, in kind of popular sort of sting Sting-inspired understandings of tantric practice, in which it's sexual intercourse which goes on, without consummation or without ejaculation. Within the tantric Buddhist traditions, there are 4 stages of bliss, and the third one involves ejaculation for the man, obviously, and then the fourth one is the kind of post-orgasmic state. Now, Hatha Yoga, as understood in these very earliest obscure references in these tantric Buddhist texts, is explained as a reversal. Now, this is new. This is hot off the press, by the way.
Heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, exactly. A new edition, this amazingly scholarly book known as the Red Brick, this huge red hardback of a text called the Khecarīvidyā, published by 2 fantastic scholars, Harunaga Isaacson and Francesco Sfera. And in that, they analyze these, they go into quite a lot of detail about the arguments within these tantric Buddhist traditions about Hatha Yoga. And basically, the Hatha Yoga, it is defined in some texts in which it is said to be the sort of forceful stopping of the bindu or bodhicitta in these traditions, i.e. the semen from leaving the penis during the sexual ritual. And it's then the kind of scholarly commentators and exegetes, they say that Hatha Yoga is reversing the 3rd and 4th blisses of the tantric rite. Now, it's not explained exactly what that means, but I suspect that this is, this perhaps is a kind of some of the earliest evidence for this notion of non-orgasmic or non-ejaculatory tantric ritual. And I think what we can also see in subsequent proper Hatha Yoga texts, Hatha Yoga texts where the practices are actually taught. So in that first one that I mentioned earlier, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, we've got this Vajroli Mudra, which is a practice of kind of urethral suction, of being able to draw liquids up the penis. And I've just written I gave a lecture on this a while ago, which I put up on my academia site, but I've just completely revised it, and it's going to be it's ready for publication, I think. And anyway, I argue in that the purpose of this practice is to overcome the ejaculatory impulse. And again, in the name Vajroli is very redolent of tantric Buddhist traditions. Hindu Shaiva tantric traditions don't talk about Vajras. So Vajroli instantly suggests that we're coming out of tantric Buddhism here. So it seems that somehow we have Hatha Yoga, when it then becomes synthesized in the 15th century in the Hatha Pradipika, is the Hatha Pradipika brings together loads of different streams of yogic practice. Okay, and one of them is seems to be this tradition that was derived from these tantric Buddhist cults. But those tantric Buddhist cults lineages died out in India sometime around 13th, 14th century, it seems. There are traces of them. They continued in Tibet, but they pretty much vanished from India. So yeah, this is something I'm looking into a lot at the moment, because another text. So the earliest text to teach any of the practices that then become defined as Hatha Yoga is a text called the Amrita Siddhi. So that's earlier than this 13th century Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. And I've been working on this for the last 10 years or something, but maybe more, even 15 years. I've had manuscripts of it. But only 2 years ago, I got hold of this, possibly, it's a long, complicated story, and I actually doubt it now, but a manuscript that says it was written in the 12th century. I have a feeling that it's a copy of a manuscript that was written in the 12th century, and they've just copied the colophon, the bit at the end that says what the date is. But anyway, it's an old text, and it's called the Amrita Siddhi. It teaches 3 of the mudras of Hatha Yoga, so the Mahabandha, the Mahabedha, and the Mahamudra. And I had the privilege of reading it very closely with a colleague in Oxford who's expert on tantric Buddhism, which I am not. And it became clear there were bits of it that had remained obscure to me, but by reading it with him and with this very old manuscript, it soon became clear that the text itself was composed by tantric Buddhists again. So there seems to be the early stream, the earliest mentions and evidence of Hatha Yogic practice in texts, at least, derived from these tantric Buddhist traditions.
I see. So the stream, the kind of stream of practices that you're speaking about, is this the same as what you refer to in your book as the Bindu Dharana ascetic tradition of Hatha Yoga?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So then when does that become grafted onto, and where does the Kundalini-oriented kind of chakra-related, you call it Laya Yoga, come from? And how does that sort of intersection take place?
Okay, well, I mean, this is exactly what my work is at the moment, is trying to, untangle
tease
that out. So it's become apparent that within these Buddhist traditions, it's slightly more complicated, because this Amrita Siddhi text, for example, is very much for celibate yogis, whereas obviously these other Vajrayana traditions are for people who are having ritual sex. And we see something and then in some way they are connected with these Nath yogi traditions, so Goraknath and Matsyendranath. And again, I've been sort of looking on the ground as well at the geographical sites where these things might have happened, been doing field work in Western India and Karnataka and in Gujarat and so forth. Now, those sites are also places where of the Kaula traditions of Shaivism, so of tantric Shiva worship, the Paschimamnaya, which is the Western stream. Now, these sites are where this Paschimamnaya stream flourished, and it's within that tradition, associated with Matsyendranath, who's said to be the first guru of this Nath order, or the first human guru. It's within those traditions that we see the earliest development of Kundalini, and in particular the 6 chakra system, which then gets mixed up, gets overlaid onto this Bindu Yoga sort of paradigm that we find in the Amrita Siddhi and Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. So all these things get sort of mixed together. The first evidence of the mixing as such is probably in a text called the Viveka-Martanda, 13th century text that's attributed to Goraksha or Goraknath. And so there you get both and there it's done rather clumsily. The two are just kind of interleaved without trying to make too much sense of it. But you get these, in some ways, somewhat conflicting paradigms. In particular, the ascetic traditions that are, obsessed with hanging on to their bindu. Mm-hmm. For them, for them, you use these mudras, you use these physical techniques to reverse the general kind of downward flow of the body, to turn the breath back up through the central channel, and at the same time force the bindu back up through the central channel and keep them all jammed in the head. Now, the same practices get mixed with the visualization-based techniques of these Kundalini and chakra traditions. And so the same practices are then taught as methods of raising Kundalini up into the head. But then what happens? You get a curious thing. I remember finding a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, looking into this and suddenly realizing what was going on, because some of the texts, they'll say, okay, so Kundalini, and these are the texts associated with these more ascetic traditions that are perhaps also obsessed with the whole Bindu Dharana, holding on to the Bindu thing. They will say, right, Kundalini is the goddess. She rises up the central channel. She meets Shiva in the head. They join together in blissful union, and then they just kind of disappear. And that's it. That's kind of samadhi, or final nirvana. Those are in the more ascetic traditions. And then we find in the more kind of worldly, perhaps world-embracing traditions, less renunciatory, such as we find in the Khecarīvidyā. She goes up, Kundalini goes up to the head, hangs out with Shiva, has fun with him, bathes in this pool of Amrita, or the nectar of immortality that's said to be found in the skull, and then she goes back down to her base at the bottom of the spine, and on the way she floods the body with the nectar of immortality that she's picked up in the head, thereby making it younger and immortal and so forth. It all gets interesting in terms of combining these different paradigms, first of all in about the 13th century with the Viveka-Martanda, and then it's the Hatha Pradipika in the 15th century that kind of really tries to bring all kinds of traditions together, including ones that perhaps are more closely related to modern yoga practice, modern sort of asana
Right. And one thing I thought was interesting about that is you remark that the Hatha Pradipika is the first text to start to distance itself from its sectarian roots, preparing the way for a pan-Indian yoga. So was this intentional? Was there a desire within, the Hatha yogis at this time to distance themselves from their sectarian roots in order to be kind of evangelist in this way? Or is the motivation something else? Or was there a motivation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's, my answers will be speculative.
Right.
But yes, because you're quoting things that I wrote quite a long time ago, and anyone listening who reads my work, I would always advise them to read the latest thing, because I'm afraid I can change my mind, or maybe I should say my thoughts are constantly evolving. But no, I think that still stands up. And yes, because in the Hatha Pradipika, for example, there's no mention of mantras. I think that's very significant, and I think that's not just because there's a slight backlash in particularly the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, an earlier text, which mantra is often associated with the tantric traditions, and it's the distance itself from that. But I think in the Hatha Pradipika, that's not really what it's doing. I think it's more because it doesn't want to. Mantras are generally the key to a particular tradition, to a particular religious tradition. So, a Shaiva text will teach Shaiva mantras and so forth. And by identifying the mantras, you can kind of work out what tradition a text is affiliated with. Similarly, with visualizations, if you look at the dhyana, the meditation section in a text, and you find what God is being visualized for meditation, that gives you a very good idea of what religious tradition the text is associated with. But we get none of that in the Hatha Pradipika. We get long lists of sort of yogic masters from a variety of traditions. Now, there are plenty of yogic masters from the Natha tradition who are listed at the beginning. I think there's about 30 of them. But actually, some of the names in that list are nothing to do with the Natha tradition, and in fact are known to have kind of been in rivals of theirs or in competition with them. And then elsewhere we get mentions of Vasishta, for example, as being one of the sages who devised the various different postures taught in the text. So yeah, it seems to be trying to appeal to a wide audience. But I don't think. So my feeling is, my general feeling, again, it's very much conjecture, but that these texts were not written by or for the kind of full-time ascetic yogis. The texts are written for a wider kind of more general audience, perhaps of kind of sophisticated, rich patrons. But yeah, so something like the Hatha Pradipika is not, is the author Swatma Rama is kind of cunningly, I think, he's bringing together teachings from lots of traditions which are in themselves, do have strongly articulated philosophical and religious standpoints, but he kind of airbrushes them out. He leaves out those bits, so he brings them all together, and he brings it together into a synthesis that should be reasonably palatable to everyone. There's no religious or metaphysical dogma, and there's no key indicators of sectarian affiliation, like I mentioned, mantras and visualizations and so forth. And I think we find that more and more after the Hatha Pradipika as well. Lots of the texts that are then produced dealing with Hatha Yoga just look at the practice isolated on its own. The author at the beginning might say something to his Ishta Devata, to his chosen God, but then when the teaching progresses, it's then framed in a way that anyone can do it regardless of their religious affiliation.
Okay, excellent. So now I want to move into a few, I guess, maybe more provocative questions. And the first one is your thoughts on how the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, and for those that are listening, Patanjala Yoga Shastra, as I understand it, is meant to refer to both the sutras and their commentary, of which they can't be separated. Is that correct? Or is it just the immediate commentary of Vyasa, or is it the whole commentarial tradition?
Oh no, it's just Vyasa.
Okay, great.
Just or supposedly Vyasa, because now the that generally accept it, but there are plenty of people who don't accept it. But I think I fall on the side of accepting it.
Okay. That they were two separate figures, you mean?
No. The root text and the commentary that known as the Bhashya, which not until much later was ascribed to Vyasa.
Okay.
This is one of the things. So Philip Maas is a scholar based in Vienna, now he's in Leipzig. He's written extensively on that. So he's the guy. He's working on a critical edition of the Yoga Shastra, Patanjali Yoga Shastra, and he has very clearly articulated this argument.
Okay. So my question then is, what are your thoughts on the Hatha yoga tradition as it is, represented in the West today, grounding itself and really talking about the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as sort of the central and seminal text of their tradition. And you remark, and I can't remember which writing it was, that, this seems in some sense problematic because this is sort of more aligned with a kind of philosophical tradition that is not exactly the Hatha Yoga tradition. So what are your thoughts on that kind of marriage of these two, the philosophical and the Hatha Yoga practices as we're seeing it in, teacher trainings and yoga studios?
Well, my thoughts. I mean, whenever I think about it, so in Roots of Yoga, I think someone actually counted the number of texts that we've provided translations from, and counted 160. We never actually got around to counting it, but of those 160, much the most difficult one is the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So that's for each kind of line of translation of that's the most time was spent on that, because it's incredibly dense. It's an incredibly difficult text full of obscure idiosyncratic usages of terminology, complex shastric type constructions and so forth. These sutras in themselves are very terse aphorisms. It's difficult to tease out their meaning, and then the commentary itself is difficult too. So, and it really doesn't deal with physical yoga practice in any way.
Right.
What it deals with is the kind of mental processes that the yogi goes through in order to achieve yoga as the goal. And so I always think it's rather ironic. I mean, it's extremely difficult to understand. So I think you'd be better off starting with something like the Hatha Pradipika and just following one of the asana descriptions and trying to do that. So I think it's somewhat ironic, but at the same time, I don't think one should dismiss it completely. I think it's rather absurd that people start chanting it because it's not written in verse. It's really not
I know. I can name 3 people right now that I know that chant it. So you're saying it's not meant to be chanted?
No. These sutra texts and commentaries are not written to be chanted. They may be written to be expounded out orally.
So it wasn't part of an oral tradition?
It may have been part of an oral tradition, but it wouldn't have been chanted. The texts that are meant to be memorized are written in meter because it makes them easier to memorize. So I think probably, again, it's all conjecture. We really don't know, but probably it would have been, a guru with a manuscript sitting around reading it and then expanding. Because the way that the commentarial tradition works, that is a written representation of exactly that, of a guru reading a text and then explaining it as he goes along. So he'll give what's called a gloss. A word will come up. So Chittavritti Narodaha, and he'll give a gloss, an alternative, like a dictionary definition for each word, and then explain how the grammar goes together. And then if he thinks of something more interesting to be said, he'll say it. And that's exactly what you find in a commentary. And I don't know, you probably know better than I do, but I don't know if when people do chant it, if they're just chanting the sutras or if they're chanting the commentary as well.
No, they just chant the sutras.
Well, again, you see, so that doing that would be somewhat, completely rendered nonsensical if one accepts, which I do, Philip Maas's assertion that the sutras and the commentary were written together. And one of the key points, actually, of Philip's argument is that the commentary, the sutras don't work syntactically on their own. if that makes sense. So the grammar, the sutras actually requires, in some instances, requires the grammar of the commentary for them to make grammatical, syntactical sense. So I mean, if you're going to chant it, if you want to keep up with the latest scholarly consensus, you'd need to be chanting, well, at least reading the commentary as well.
Right. Well, that's going to blow a lot of minds. I'm glad you said that. All right. So, so then next, I want to move into a couple because we're nearing the end of our time. So one of the questions that I have is, your colleague, Mark Singleton, who helped you with the book Roots of Yoga, which I thought was it's ironic, seems to me, that he worked on a text that really is about the kind of, the heritage of Hatha Yoga in the original manuscripts, and at least the way that his book has been received, which is, I think, different, and this is maybe where you can chime in about it, because a lot of people, I think, have taken the Yoga Body, that book, and read from it the idea, which I don't think is the claim he's making, that all modern asana is derivative of, Swedish gymnastics, and that really what we're seeing doesn't pre-exist the 20th century. Do you think that is a misunderstanding of what his argument is, or do you think that, I just wonder what your thoughts are on this, because it seems funny that he would be involved in a project like Roots of Yoga when his project in Yoga Body seems to be so, at least on the surface, so antithetical to that.
Well, I think that is a misrepresentation. And he was it last year or year before? There was, I think it was what country was it? Serbian edition of Roots of Yoga, which he provided a new introduction for, and he much more eloquently than I can sort of argues his case there. But no, he's never said that it's all new.
Okay.
He's just said that there are elements of it, and in some schools there are very significant, prominent elements of it that we don't find, in pre-modern sources on yoga, i.e., the text.
Yeah.
So he gets, there's a kind of Singleton light theory, isn't it, that it's all made up.
Yeah, I think that's in a lot of ways how, at least in the kind of conversation in the wider yoga community, those who kind of take that book and kind of run with it, usually that's what they reduce it to, is this sort of argument that yoga is no older than than Krishnamacharya, or the asana yoga is no older than Krishnamacharya, and before that it was just meditation or something like that.
Well, then that's clearly not true, because we the asanas, but we get teachings on asanas, seated postures from 2,000 years ago. Or is that the oldest? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, about 2,000 years ago. And then it's not until about 1,000 years ago we start getting more complex postures taught in text. But we know that they were being done from other sort of external texts which talk about what yogis are up to. And they'll say, there was a yogi standing on his leg or whatever.
Yeah.
We know that goes back as well to the time of Alexander the Great. Then within the Hatha Yoga textual tradition, we see a kind of steady proliferation of the number of postures that are taught. Now, what we don't see, in fact, the reason I was slightly late now is because I was talking to Mark and Jason Birch, another colleague on our project. He's in Mysore at the moment, because we're looking at 2 or 3 texts. Obviously, Mysore is central, is key to this, key to the development of yoga in the modern world. But there is evidence in some of these texts that something was going on in India prior to any influence from globalized physical practice tradition. So that's something that we're trying to delineate at the moment. We have there's a text called the Hathabhyasa Paddhati, which was then used as a source text for a text called the Sri Tattva Nidhi, which Norman Sioman has published sections of, in particular the asana section of. And one of the things we're looking at in there, I mean, that involves postures using ropes, some repeated dynamic movements, and we do find repeated dynamic movements actually in a couple of other sort of 18th century yoga texts. But what we don't find, and in fact, there's a slight within, I think Mark and Jason are keener than I am to find evidence of sequences within this text, but there's possibly some sequences. In fact, actually, I'll do a little plug now that well, you only get a sort of a glimpse of it, but you'll be able to listen to more as well. I had a workshop as part of the project. We held a workshop in London and Oxford in September last year. And one of the things we did was to go through this text, the Hatha Paddhati, which Jason got a manuscript of from Pune, and we go through that text with a couple of yogis trying to do the positions and trying to see how they would work as sequences. Because it does seem possible that there's some kind of sequential practice going on. But even if there is, it's nothing like what we find in this sort of Ashtanga yoga, this sort of 3 or 4 series that you find there with these very closely prescribed vinyasa joining, linking sequences and so forth. We absolutely don't find anything like that.
Right, okay. So then... The David Gordon White's Sinister Yogis. I read your article, and I found it very refreshing because I actually, I didn't obviously have enough scholarly understanding to be able to point it out, but something felt like something was wrong about it. I had this hunch that it wasn't the whole story, and you really wonderfully deconstruct some of his position on that. So I wonder if you would just sort of rehash a little bit of that and why, what was David Gordon White's agenda in that book and why is it sort of problematic from a textual perspective? Okay,
well, I always felt it was a rather strongly worded article. It
was very polemical, but it was great.
Well, I put so much time into it, and as you can tell, it was a lot of work, and I went very closely through the book. So in the end, I felt I should publish it, and I hope I've done a service to the scholarly and wider yoga community by doing so.
Has he reached out about it?
He did, yeah, before it was published, actually. He got me to send him a draft, yeah. And I like David. David's a great guy, but in terms of his scholarship, I think, there's lots of great stuff in there, and I think I say that in the article.
You do, yeah.
Lots of interesting things. But what he often, and he's done this with his other books, he feels the need to tie all that into some grand narrative theory. And in that one, in Sinister Yogis, the grand narrative theory is that yogis were all bad, weird magician. Okay? Which, obviously there are plenty of cases of that happening, but to kind of then say that's what it was all about. And then he, in some, I think, and again in the article, I point out instances where he quotes from a text, something that talks about a yogi using do something bad, but then he ignores the bit in the previous chapter which says about the lovely good yogi sitting on the mountainside meditating quietly for the good of humanity.
Yeah.
So he sort of cherry picks his stuff a bit. And actually, going back to Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, I really enjoyed David's book on Patanjali. It was a biography.
Yeah.
It's one of and he writes very well, and it's very engaging. And he was one of the people early on got me right into studying all of this, and I enjoyed that book. But again, I think that the one major flaw in that book for me is that, again, he wants to have this. He has this grand narrative of, Patanjali was not important in India until the West got interested in yoga. And he says that the text had fallen into obscurity over the last 500 years. Now, that's just simply not true. I haven't published anything on this because
Please do.
Habit of polemics and stuff. But if one looks at manuscript catalogues from at the moment, there are, and you look at the lists of yoga texts, by far the biggest number of manuscripts is of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra or Yoga Shastra, and they're all relatively recent, from the last 200, 300, 400 years, and it's always been the scholarly go-to text. If you're a pundit in India and you come across some reference about yoga in a text that you're commenting on, you go, oh God, right now I better go and look up Patanjali, see what he's got to say about it, and put in a quote there. And it's always had that position. So yeah, what I think with David, I think maybe he's trying to make these big, outrageous points.
Yeah.
Or, make a big point, but then as a result, he misses the nuance, or he deliberately plays down the nuances in the story.
And I also like that you point out, you say that essentially he reduces the practices to the powers or the siddhis, what are the result of practices, rather than talking about the practice itself.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I think and I cite some evidence for that in the book. Exactly.
Yeah, it's great, and you can find that for anybody listening who's interested in that, because I know, you see. I always find it funny that when I see a yoga practitioner, a modern day yoga practitioner reading that book, because I just imagine it being very destabilizing, or if you're really interested in the history of actually giving credence or justifying your practice today in some way. So
can I say one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Also, his book Alchemical Body. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
big sort of encyclopedic almost, and that again I think suffers from a similar problem. I mean, it's full of wonderful nuggets of information that he's dug up from really obscure places, and he does a great job of presenting all this stuff. But again, he's got this idea that he's presenting that Hatha yoga and alchemy are inseparable. Now that's one of the things that I said when I got to the end of my PhD thesis and I looked at what I'd done and how I tried to contextualize the text within a bigger understanding of the yoga tradition. And it was immediately apparent to me that there was absolutely no need to know anything about alchemy whatsoever to understand this text. And in fact, the one mention of alchemy in it, I think, is it says, or maybe it even disses alchemy at one point. Certainly some other Hatha yoga texts do say that alchemy is an obstruction to practice. And I think that text says that, among a list of other things, it says if you get the practice right, then you will automatically get the powers of alchemy. But it's not as if it's framed within an alchemical paradigm in any way. So that's again something that I think may confuse. If students wanting to understand the history of yoga come to that book, they may think, right, it's all about alchemy, but it's really not. I mean, there were parallel traditions within the history, and the alchemists were an important part, but they were not the people who were doing Hatha yoga.
I see. So, do you think that habit that he has is really a kind of wider sort of scholarly, based on a wider scholarly desire when writing books to have some kind of, thread of theory that's going to kind of tie the whole thing together? Is that, is that something that we see often and not really something that is specific to David Gordon White?
Gosh, well, no, I wouldn't say you do see it that often. Certainly not the scholars that I read.
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm generally reading. The thing is, another thing I'd say about it is that he's not really what I would call a philologist, David.
Right. Yeah. You make a few observations, sort of scathing critiques of his mistranslations and
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's again, people have been dismissive of philology and manuscript work and so forth. But within the Indian tradition in particular, there are estimates that there are 30 million manuscripts out there in libraries in India, of which only 1%, if that, less, have been read in the last 100 years. And so just about any subject that you're looking into, and this has been what's such a joy for me over the last 20, 25 years, whatever, is that there are, all these manuscripts, all this new stuff on yoga and Hatha yoga in particular that hasn't been looked at. So you really need to go back and look closely at the text. So, I think David perhaps is too quick to make big generalizing theories without having looked at all the evidence. So this is what happened. Then started looking closely at the evidence, and then, hang on, it doesn't match what I've read in David's and other books. So I try, I try to restrict myself to reading the serious textual scholars who are engaging directly with the manuscripts and the texts of the tradition, because if you're not doing that, then you're not really unearthing anything new, and there's a good chance that anything you say is going to be knocked down by someone who does look at the text, because often there are only evidence.
So then let's end on kind of an inspiring note for those who are, the small minority of our audience who will be interested in kind of looking at these texts. So, and I've heard this is a common refrain now, that there are just so many texts and still so few scholars really focused on them. Yes. And
yeah.
So is there, is the environment conducive? I mean, obviously you have research for your work, but is this sort of a general kind of shift to there is a lot of support and funding for this kind of research if someone was to be interested in becoming a philologist like yourself and working with texts in this way?
No, I think it's getting more difficult, to be honest.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
Yeah, because as we sort of touched upon briefly before, the humanities departments and Indology departments in universities have been slowly being shut down, over the last few decades. This kind of neoliberalist idea of the university, it doesn't really fit,
Yeah.
In England now, just this new thing just came in the last month, whereby universities are graded on their teaching, and one of the, which is ridiculous in itself, but one of the ways they try to measure quality of teaching is by the jobs that your graduates get.
No.
Yeah.
Oh,
and how
my
well paid they are. So that's not
in the UK.
Yeah, that's not good news for Sanskrit. Apparently, we're the only country in the world. The minister was proudly saying we're the first country in the world to introduce this.
I thought the UK was always so level-headed about these kinds of things.
Oh, yeah. What about Brexit? I think our reputation being level-headed about anything is going
He's gone out the window. All right. Well, this has been such an interesting conversation. James, is there anything that you want to end with in terms of, I don't know, an overarching idea or something you want to share about your research or anything else that we maybe haven't mentioned?
No, well, as you say, I mean, I do hope that that mine and my colleagues' research, does inspire further students to get stuck in, read the text closely. So the project that I'm engaged on at the moment, we're going to produce 10 critical editions of texts that haven't been published before. And we will also have 2 or 3 books going with that to analyze them and contextualize them historically. But they will provide a huge fund of new kind of a new resource for anyone to go in and kind of think about any aspect of the history of yoga, and there'll be lots of material there, and hopefully that will inspire people to write their own books and learn Sanskrit themselves and go and find the other texts that deal with these things and keep this kind of tradition of scholarship and alive. And also, I would also say that for anyone who really does want to understand where it's all coming from, I think it's a good idea to go out to India and hang out with some yogis as well.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a very different world from the yoga studio in London.
I bet, yeah. So then, for somebody that's interested in studying the text, would they need to kind of do the kind of global research that you've done, or are there some online databases now of texts that are untranslated, and is there anyone working on that?
That's a good point. Yeah, more and more libraries are digitizing their collections. So, yeah, for example, that made me think instantly of in Jodhpur, the Mehrangarh Fort there has got the richest library of yoga texts in the world, because the Maharaja in the early 19th century was a major devotee of yogis, and they have digitized their entire collection. I don't think they put it up online, but I think if you write to them, and they may ask for a little bit of money, but they will send you scans of their manuscripts and so forth. And hundreds and hundreds of those texts have not been translated or published or anything like that. So yeah, that's a rich resource for sure.
All right, excellent. All right, great. So then, James, is there for anyone that wants to kind of get in touch with you or ask you any questions, is there a way? Should we just point them to your academia.edu page? I'm not sure if you have a website or anything.
Yeah, I've got a website that I haven't updated for years at www.khecarī.com, KHECARI.com. But probably more useful will be our project website, which is hyp.soas, so soas.ac.uk. And as I mentioned, I think we're about to go live on there with a film of our workshop, which includes some of this sort of, trying to make sense of asanas through the text, and also all the audio and the handouts that went with all the 20 presentations from these fantastic scholars, all working on manuscripts of yoga texts. So, and if anyone actually wants to contact me, then just write on my work address, my SOAS email address, which is JM, it's for Jim Mallinson, jm63@soas.ac.uk.
All right, excellent. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that video, and when it gets shared on the website, I'll go ahead and link to that in the show notes to this podcast.
It may even be today. It might even be today.
Oh, really? Oh, cool. Okay, I'll check it out. All right, thanks, James, so much. This has been such a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for all the excellent work that you're doing.
All right, thanks, Jacob. Thanks a lot.